I'm John Bowen. I'm an Extension Master Gardener Volunteer here in Buncombe County, and I get to be your host today. We'll have a lot to cover, and we'll try to get to questions, make every effort to answer them throughout the program and at the end. I want to welcome you to Gardening in the Mountains Invasive Plant Management. We're glad to have Alison Arnold and Luke Owen with us today. Luke is the commercial horticulture agent here in Buncombe County. He works with ornamental growers and green industry professionals. Alison Arnold is the consumer horticulture agent in Buncombe County and the Extension Master Gardener Program Coordinator. She works to provide gardening information for gardeners in the Buncombe County area. Today, Alison and Luke will be focusing on key strategies for the more challenging invasive plants that are commonly found in Western North Carolina. They're going to offer some practical tactics to help identify, manage, and prevent the spread of those plants. Take it away, Alison.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I want to thank you for joining Luke and I for our program today. We're going to be sharing this talk and going over invasive plant management. Our objectives today, of course, to talk about the importance of control and their impacts that invasive plants have on our region. We're going to go through some common invasive plants that we have here, what we call the big 10 or 12 in our area. We'll cover what we feel like we can today. And then we're going to talk about some realistic IPM approaches or strategies for managing these invasive plants. So what is an invasive plant? We have invasive species in general, insects, animals, all kinds of organisms. They are defined as a species that is non-native or alien to an ecosystem, meaning it's not commonly found in that environment or that ecosystem. We're not going to go into whether they're exotic, native, or non-native. We're just using this definition. They are likely to cause economic, environmental, or harm to human health. So they become quite problematic when they come into ecosystems that they're not normally found. How do they become invasive and are successful? A lot of them that we deal with originate from Eastern Asia that has a very similar climate to us. As you can see in this map, there's Eastern Asia there, and then there's Southeastern US. Those climates are very similar, and they adapt very easily. Some in their native habitat have pests and pathogens that control them. But here in our area, we don't have those. I have a picture of the kudzu bug, which does control kudzu in its native habitat. It is found in our area, and it's actually a pest on soybeans and other legumes. So that's a double whammy for that. And it doesn't really help us with kudzu control. Invasive plants are very successful in our area because they thrive in disturbed soil and environments. This is especially where soil is exposed and where there's an abundant amount of sunshine that allows those seeds to germinate and grow and for the plant to grow. This is a photo along the Swannanoa River in East Asheville after Helene. I think we're all very aware that Helene is raising the prospect of a lot of invasive species to really succeed and emerge in the coming months and years. Invasive plants are successful and become invasive because they reproduce and spread rapidly by seeds and roots. The seed production is enormous on many of the plants. They don't only reproduce abundant seed loads, but they also reproduce quite readily and they spread readily. How are they spread? They're distributed by wind, birds, and humans, but mainly accidental by humans. This allows them to move great distances, especially wind, which is one of the concerns after Helene. In the fall, a lot of invasive species were in fruit and seed, and we had high winds and lots of rain and flooding, which of course carries seed great distances. Humans also move them on equipment. We move them when we move soil or purchase mulch, when we share and buy plants. So we do need to be careful with that. Some invasives exude a chemical that can inhibit growth of plants nearby. This is an image of Japanese stiltgrass or microstegium that is known to exude a chemical in its roots that can inhibit plant growth nearby. Roots can run long distances and cover plants very easily and keep them from growing as well. This is a picture of a bamboo shoot, which we know can run distances that are mysterious and true. So basically, invasive plants, they're opportunistic. They take opportunity for exposed soils and sun. They're very adaptable and they're very competitive. That's why we find them so challenging. The impacts are numerous. Not only do they compete, but also by that competition, they decrease overall plant diversity in areas and they degrade wildlife habitat, agricultural lands, water quality, recreation opportunities, and soil stability. So the impacts are great, especially in sensitive areas where plants are endangered or threatened. In this picture, we can think of how the entire ecosystem changes. When you have a cover like this kudzu is showing, there's really not a lot of room for anything else to grow, which decreases so much of the habitat and everything within the ecosystem. The point of our talk today is to talk about what can be done as good gardeners. Be aware of those plants that are even sold in nurseries and garden centers that we do not want to plant. Yes, we are aware that English ivy is still available in the market, and we scratch our heads and wonder why when we're fighting it out in the landscape. This is an ongoing conversation. There's a lot of work being done to breed sterile plants, a whole nother talk down the road. But in ornamentals, there are a lot of plants that we don't want to plant, and we want to educate ourselves. We want to try and treat and cut and remove plants before they go to seed. And especially when seeds aren't present, we want to do that work. If we are removing seed or fruit, we want to bag it and dispose of it. Whenever we can, and Luke will go over this again later on when we get to vines, we want to cut vines from trees. Do everything we can to keep invasive vines and shrubbery out of trees. As we know with English ivy, once it goes vertical, it becomes mature and starts setting seeds. If we can keep it on the ground, that reduces the spread of that particular plant and plants in general. Grasses, but also any plant, the seed of these plants can get on our shoes, our clothes, with our dogs when we're walking, tires of our vehicles and equipment. So if we're in an infested area, we know that we want to try and clean our equipment and our materials well before we leave that site. Something we don't really think about how easy it is for seeds to move around just on our clothing. Another important thing is that we want to encourage or work with neighbors on adjacent properties. This is probably more realistic in smaller areas in town. We get calls here at the office where people have worked very diligently on their own properties, but next door or down the street, there's kudzu, bittersweet, privet, some of the big guns nearby. Whatever we can do to help our neighbors learn and also control those plants is important. We're going to start with talking about identification. If you're not familiar with invasive plants, an important thing is to become familiar with what they look like, what their fruit looks like. We don't want to be removing or eliminating plants that are good for our environment. Smartphone apps are really helpful. They're getting better and better, but it's important to verify. Once you get an image, even if you use Google Lens or anything like that, you want to get a double or even a third verification to make sure that plant is actually what the smartphone says it is, because it doesn't always get it right. iNaturalist is a common application where many people will input images and are involved in that identification. So that's a very reliable one. Buncombe County Extension Master Gardener Helpline here at the office. Agents and master gardeners are available to help identify these last three. The National Invasive Species Information Center has lots of information on invasive species, which you can run through to learn about identification. We do have a number of resources at the end of our program that we'll be sharing with you. The Invasive Plant Atlas of the US and the EDDS map are also very good. This is iNaturalist. And the good thing about this is that you can look at your location. You can upload a photo for identification. You can post it to where you found it. And then, as you can see here in the image, Tree of Heaven has been identified. And these are all in the Asheville area. I think this shows 13 observations, 11 observers, and 11 people that are identifying. So you've got some verification there with iNaturalist. This also works on animals and insects. iNaturalist is a great program. Why don't we take any questions that we might have?
Allison, we've had a couple of questions. One is about whether we think that our changing climate, our warming days, and particularly our warming nights, are going to cause a shift or an increase in the number of invasive species that we see.
Yes, the common thought is that we're going to see them more. They're predicting longer growing seasons, which is going to give more of a chance for things to take hold. Plants will move into our areas that we might not see so much, but we know that plants that are in southern zones more than likely will move into our area. That's a big concern.
Okay, good. Another question, and this may be one that Luke is going to answer when he gets into what he's doing now, but the apps that you were showing us are good about identifying some plants. Are they good at helping us distinguish between invasive plants and non-invasive plants? I'm thinking about, say, the Multiflora rose and the Carolina rose. Are they good at helping us identify the real culprits here?
Not to my knowledge. I've not run into that. There are some good publications on mistaken lookalikes. And sometimes when you do a search, others will come up that do look alike, but it's not always possible.
Okay, Luke, are you ready to take over now?
Picking up where Allison left off, this is a resource that Allison had mentioned, the Invasive Plant Atlas. This is another great way to see distribution maps of where invasive plants are in the region. Control versus eradication is a really important thing to keep in mind here. In a lot of areas that you might see invasive plants, especially areas where they've been established for some time, you're going to see invasive plant populations that are so large that complete eradication might not be the realistic goal, or it's going to take a long period of time to get good management and control. So the question here is, how established is this population? This informs us of what control practices we can use, and we'll talk more about that. True management does take time. Invasive plant management is not solved in just one active growing season. Typically, it's over multiple growing seasons that you start to see some good control. Importantly, there's no silver bullets. You've got to look at it holistically in terms of various strategies, both using monitoring, and we're going to cover that, some knowing what we're dealing with, and then using all of the tools at our disposal to really address these invasive plant concerns. The first subset of strategies that I want to talk about is something we call mechanical strategies, or strategies that allow us to maybe even prevent invasive plants from becoming an issue in the first place. The first strategy here would be to encourage native plants to thrive in our areas. You can see here some photos of a natural forested floor here in Western North Carolina. Importantly, what you don't see a lot of here is exposed ground for invasive plants to become established and really get a foothold. So by encouraging our native plants and identifying what our native plants are, we can selectively go in our forested areas or on your property and know what plants do I need to encourage and which plants do I need to be on the lookout for. If your invasive plant populations are small enough, or you would like to try to get in there and physically remove them, that of course is a viable strategy. Depending on the size of your population, it might not be the sole strategy that you use. That just depends on you, your goals, and the resources that you have available to you. Plant removal, of course, is a surefire way to really address invasive plant problems. In particular, we're going to talk about some invasive plants where removal is going to be quite difficult based on adaptations that plant material has. Underground rhizomes, if you don't get every bit of that root fragment, it might come back. Smother and cover is another great strategy that we have, where basically you tarp certain areas to restrict sunlight, that critical resource that plants need to grow. This is a great strategy to clear patches of ground where you might have invasive plants become an issue. Repetitive mowing is oftentimes a strategy in invasive plant control. You can see here a couple plants that we're actually going to talk about today, some bamboo there, as well as microstegium, and how mowing can become an overall strategy in terms of preventing establishment, preventing seeds from getting out and creating a seed bank of invasive plants that we have to manage. We also have some biological controls available to us depending on the nature of the plant in question. Goats is one of those biological controls that we have. Here is an example of kudzu. This is a property here in Asheville where you can see on the left-hand side, this before photo, and on the right-hand side, this is after just one season of the goats being on this property. So you can see what a good resource biological control can have on invasive plants. Prescribed burning can be a resource depending on the situation. I know the Forest Service uses this to manage that forest floor and to promote natural vegetation that might actually need fire to regenerate. We're not really going to talk about that today in terms of a strategy that you can use in your home, but know that prescribed burning is a strategy that we have on a larger scale to control invasive plants. Getting into more of that plant removal aspect, plant removal itself is feasible only if there's a few plants or if you have the right resources, manpower to get it done. Importantly, you've got to dig out the roots. A lot of our invasive plants will resprout from any root fragments that are left in the soil. It's going to be important to monitor that site where you do any physical removal for a couple years afterwards to make sure that we're not cutting the head off the snake and then having 10 more heads pop up in its place. Just be aware of that. Replanting something else or mulching, it's strategy moving forward to not leave that exposed soil, removing those invasive plants. By establishing something else in its place, we can prevent those invasives from coming right back there where you were doing that treatment. Let's get into chemistry now. I want to focus on chemistries, meaning herbicides, something that we have in our toolbox as part of our overall management. It's important that we talk about how we safely utilize these tools to keep us safe as well as the environment and those around us. So the first thing that I want you to think about in terms of herbicide as a tool is a situational assessment, starting off with inventorying around where you're potentially going to treat an invasive plant population. What are some overall features that you might find in that area? Are there wooded areas that are around where you're treating? Is there going to be wildlife that I need to be concerned about? Am I in a residential area? Do I have neighbors that could potentially be impacted that are downhill from me? Waterways, are there any aquatic environments in the area? These are going to be important because as we talk about some of these chemistry tools that we have at our disposal, some are only labeled for certain environments. You may have one product labeled for use only in residential areas, and it actually says to not use it near any body of water. So by inventorying those natural areas, we are aware of those environments that we need to be concerned about and to protect, especially when we talk about reading pesticide labels, which we will get into. And then, of course, thinking about what are your goals? Think long term, right? Are you going to plant something back in that site? What's the overall management plan for the area in question? Depending on the chemistries that we use, some of our tools have longer residual life in the soil. So it might inhibit us planting back there in the future. A lot of the tools that we're going to go over today are selected specifically for shorter residual times in the soil that allow us to plant back in those areas. So just think about what your goals are for the site in question. And then, of course, identification of the plant to be treated. When we're talking about that situational assessment, we've got to know what we're treating to select that right tool for the job. This situational assessment that we've discussed here is just overarching conclusions that inform us what options we have moving forward to effectively address invasive plant management. The second thing I want to talk about in terms of chemical safety, and probably one of the more important things that we need to talk about, is the PPE requirements, or personal protective equipment. These requirements are going to be included on the label itself, and it will vary depending on what product you use. If you ever have a question about what types of things do I need to put on or use to protect myself, you can always resort to looking at that label, and it will tell you exactly what you need to wear. This is going to be important in that it minimizes the exposure that we have to the chemical in question. So it's very important that we follow that label, not only because the label is the law and that we are to follow the instructions included on that label. It's a great way that we can protect ourselves. This is an example of a pesticide label that says applicators must wear long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes, and chemical resistant gloves. This is a flyer on the right from the National Safety Pesticide Information Center. I really like it because these are some common PPE that we wear anytime we spray herbicide. Again, those specific requirements are going to be on the pesticide label that you use. Let's talk about those labels. I mentioned the label is the law, meaning we have to follow all aspects of that label. When you purchase a product in the store, essentially the label is like a contract between the applicator in question, that would be us using that product, and whoever manufactures that product. By purchasing it, that label is the agreement that you must follow. Everything we need is going to be included in that label. The dosage, the specific rate that we would need for a particular situation, various instructions of how to use that product are all going to be included on that label. Here's an example of a pesticide label for Roundup Pro. Let's look at the important parts of that label. First, you're going to see on a lot of pesticide labels the trade name, right? So Roundup Pro herbicide is the trade name here. This is important to differentiate it from the active ingredient. Oftentimes I hear folks that purchase Roundup in a store say, oh, I use Roundup for controlling the weeds in my driveway. What kind of Roundup did you use? Because not all Roundup is created equally. Depending on the product that you use, the active ingredient can vary. You can see here the active ingredients that are listed is really what we should be looking at in terms of knowing what chemicals we're using. Here, the active ingredient is glyphosate, which is commonly found in Roundup, but not always. We're going to show you some examples of Roundup with different chemistries. Importantly, we've got to know what that active ingredient is. Of course, we're going to have the PPE requirements associated on that label. So that's going to be included on every label that you look at. And then also this general information, rates, how much should we dose, can vary depending on the situation. So it's important to fully read the label to determine what rate is most appropriate for a situation. It's going to tell you what things you can mix in that tank. It might say mix a surfactant into a tank, or maybe an oil that helps that herbicide penetrate the leaf better. So all of those instructions are going to be included in that general information section. Some other sections that are going to be important, you'll see here environmental hazards, meaning what should we be concerned about in terms of avoiding the spray drift or maybe avoiding pesticide use in certain areas. You can see here, do not apply directly to water or to areas where surface water is present. That's critical that we use only products that are labeled for use around waterways for that safety environmentally. Storage and disposal requirements. There's going to be a whole litany of information on a pesticide label. And if you ever have any questions about a particular product that you're using, feel free to contact us. or contact the company's phone number. There will be a phone number on every pesticide label. They actually have a helpline that's specifically meant to address our concerns as applicators. When talking about chemical safety, it's all about minimizing those off-target effects or drift that we might see. Of course, we don't want to spray any desirable plants. Typically, when we talk about herbicide for invasive plant management, we're talking about non-selective herbicides, meaning if we spray those products onto a desirable native plant, we're going to see death in our native plant populations as well. So we want to avoid drift onto anything that we want to keep. We also have to be mindful of weather. If we spray our herbicide products, we want to be mindful of wind conditions in particular to minimize drift, as well as noting that some pesticide labels will say you need a certain amount of time for that product to dry and really set in that plant before rain were to come. That can minimize the efficacy of a product. Of course, we want to keep in mind animal and human health around these sites that we might be applying chemistries. That means that before we make an application, we need to be mindful of who's around both humans and animals to make sure that area is cleared and prepared for that application. We don't want toys laying in the yard or things that we would come into contact with on a regular basis in the application area in question. That's important to keep us safe and those around us. Let's talk about specifics to invasive plant management. There's two broad categories of herbicide products that we typically have at our disposal. We have contacts, and then we have systemics. Contacts is different from systemics in that we only get control, or that herbicide product only works at the areas of the plant tissue that have been treated. Where that droplet actually makes contact with the plant tissue, that plant tissue will die or will be treated, but it's not going to be translocated or moved throughout the plant to get good control. So when we talk about invasive plant management, typically we want to use systemics or products that can be translocated throughout the tissue of the plant into the root system. That's really what differentiates contacts from systemics. You can see in this graphic on the top right what I'm talking about. Even if we spray an herbicide product on the top half of the plant, that product or that herbicide can be moved down into the root system and we can get good control there. Depending on what products you use, we talk about the residual life of treatment, or how long does that product remain active after you spray. Oftentimes we use products like glyphosate that have very short residual lives of treatment, meaning that typically only a few days after treatment, I can go in and plant back in those areas without concern of herbicide injury. Importantly, there are products that have long residual lives, some even months. Common products that we use in invasive plant management, we're going to talk about two primarily today, with the first one being glyphosate and the second one being triclopyr. Both of these are systemic products that really can perform well when it comes to invasive plants. Not to say that contact herbicides aren't a tool that we can use in our everyday garden management, but we're talking specifically today on invasive plant management, and systemics is typically what we use there. Let's talk about differences that you might see in products. Not every product is going to be formulated the same. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see here triclopyr formulated at an 8% concentration, and triclopyr versus this brush killer here at 61% concentration. Typically, when we talk about specific management, triclopyr at a higher concentration is best for cut stump treatments or for good treatment of invasive plant management. If I were to paint 8% triclopyr on a stump, we're not going to see good control. Typically, the standard that we want to see is anything above 41% concentration for a stump application, and we're going to talk about that. This graphic here just highlights that Roundup or glyphosate in general, it's different depending on the products that we use. You can see here a 41% glyphosate. That would be a great product to use for invasive plant management control. But then you have things like glyphosate ready to use products where the concentrations are like 7 or 8%. This would be good for your driveway or controlling weeds maybe in a mulch bed. But when we're talking about invasive plant management, we're talking about isolated applications of that chemical, and we need higher concentrations in order for that to work. Here's an example of a Roundup product that does not have glyphosate in it. It has triclopyr. So be mindful when you purchase a product that we're looking at not only the active ingredient, but the particular concentration percentage, because that can greatly impact our control. So let's talk about some strategies of chemical management. Flush cutting is a tool to manage the size of invasive plant, but then also to make it more susceptible to herbicide treatment. So we're cutting it off at the ground and then allowing it to flush back. And that can make that plant more susceptible to chemical products, because as the leaves get older or as invasive plants age, they have a thick, waxy coating on their leaf that can prevent herbicide from being absorbed as readily. So that's why flush cutting can be a strategy. Oftentimes, window cutting can be used, especially for our woody vine invasive plants. This cuts off water supply by cutting off a 3-foot section of the invasive plant in question. We're cutting off a section of a tree trunk and painting the bottom part of that portion with an herbicide. We call that cut stump treatments. Basically, that is translocated down to the root system, and any of our above portion parts of that invasive vine in question are going to die off due to lack of water. So let's talk about those. How do we apply a chemical effectively? There's several different ways we can apply our chemistries. We've talked about the cut stump method, which basically means physically removing or cutting off of the plant at the base level or at soil level. As soon as we cut, we want to quickly follow that up with an application of herbicide to that stump. Typically, we want to use concentrations of 41% or higher. This is going to allow for effective translocation down into the root system. Fall is the best time generally to do this treatment, because what's happening during the fall, typically in a lot of our plants, they're pulling nutrients down into the root system as they go into their dormancy period. So fall is generally a really good time of year to do this, but you can do it any time of year and get some result or some treatment. But again, fall is generally that best time. Basal bark method is a method that we use oftentimes on our larger specimens, where you would spray a band on the bottom portion of the bark. Typically, this is the bottom or the first foot of the bark. This works best for our thin bark trees and shrubs. You would spray until that bark is wet, but you don't want to puddle that product on the ground. Fall is generally a good time of year to do this for the same reasons that we mentioned about cut stump treatment. Hack and squirt method is a method that's oftentimes used in our Forest Service industry as a way of getting good treatment and then moving on in a quick fashion. Hack and squirt would be taking something like a hatchet or a knife of some kind and making marks, exposing the vascular tissue in the tree or shrub in question at a 45-degree angle, and then applying that herbicide by spraying the herbicide in that cut. Again, fall is generally a good time. You're going to see a theme here because, again, those resources are being pulled down to the root systems in question. Foliar method is good when we're spraying actively growing material. Generally, the younger the tissue is, the better. Good coverage here is critical. The more coverage we can get in the foliage, the better control we're going to see. But you've got to be mindful of drift when we're talking about spraying the foliage of a plant. And some surfactants might be needed to increase the efficacy of that treatment. So with that, I want to stop briefly before we get into these common invasive plants, if you have any questions about chemical safety.
Yes, Luke, we have a couple here. Can you comment on painting versus spraying of stump?
When I talk about spraying, if you do it in a way where you can control the droplet size and have heavier drops, you can spray and get really good coverage on that stump in question. But painting can really minimize any drift at all because we're only applying it locally at the site in question. So really, both methods are a good strategy, but when we talk about spraying, we need to be mindful of that drift and any off-target effects that we have.
I noticed in your slide about painting that the person had added some coloring agent to that herbicide. Do you recommend coloring it so you can tell what you've done?
Yes, that's a great strategy, especially in areas that have a high population of invasive plants. You can add those dyes into your tank mix that allow you to know what you've treated and what you haven't. So that's a great strategy that you can use.
What about a concern always about residuals and getting into groundwater? We talked about surface water, but what about some of these herbicides entering our groundwater? Is that a problem?
Generally, when we talk about systemics, if you're applying it in the right way, whether that be painting the herbicide or foliar spraying, we're not going to generally be spraying at a rate where that would get into our groundwater. If you did have an accidental spill or something like that, we would be concerned with some chemistries and their high residual life getting in the groundwater. In that case, it would be best to call NCDA and some of the environmental health resources that we have included on the pesticide label. But in general, when we use the products as we are instructed to, we minimize that contact or that potential contamination of groundwater.
Another question about the dyes. Someone asked where we can obtain these dyes, and they wish that Roundup had a dye so they could see what they actually sprayed. Is it sufficient just to use red food coloring from the grocery store if it's a water-based tank mix?
Typically, your dyes are going to be more oil-based, and you can find some of those on Amazon and some other locations, but that's not to say that you can't use other dyes. They may or may not work or show up. You can try and experiment with that. Generally, you're going to see dyes not impact the efficacy of the tank mix in question. You can always try that, but again, know that there are other products out there that you can purchase.
Okay. I'm going to go back to an earlier question. The person said that several years ago they cleared about 700 square feet of English ivy from a sunny slope. And they planned to plant a native plant garden in that place, but almost immediately mugwort, which is Artemisia vulgaris, moved in. She's tried to smother it. She's covered it with 5 mil black weed mat for 6 months. She's sprayed with a contact herbicide, a citrus oil weed killer, and she's tried simply pulling it. And so far, the mugwort is winning. She can't plant the natives. What might she do with a situation like that?
Mugwort is one of those particular plants where it has to have an environment conducive for it to grow. Typically, mugwort grows best in shadier and wet environments. If you can address surrounding drainage, if that's possible, to make conditions not as conducive for that plant to get established, that would be a good strategy. There are some chemistries that we can talk about maybe on a one-on-one basis. We can help them game plan what might be best moving forward.
Okay, good to know that you and Allison can be a resource for some specific problems like that. Another question, a person has a pollinator garden and their two neighbors have poison ivy creeping in from both sides. They're reluctant to use glyphosate, but they're also quite allergic to the poison ivy and don't like hand pulling it. What can they do to control poison ivy? I realize it's not an invasive species, it's a native, but still it's a control issue for many gardeners.
Yeah, smother and cover. We talked about that as a potential strategy. If you are able to tarp and cover those sections where you might see higher populations, that could be a way that you do that. I'm also very allergic to poison ivy, and I just take precautions to protect myself using gloves to try my best to protect me. But if you're anything like me, generally, if I see it, I'm getting it. So I understand the realities around that, but chemistries can also be a really good, useful tool. And wiping chemical applications can be good to minimize those off target effects. But let's go ahead and get into some of these plant profiles.
Hey, Luke, I just wanted to pipe in. There's
Yeah.
been a couple of questions in the chat box about using Dawn dishwashing liquid. And I just wanted to let people know we're not able to recommend any kind of soap like that as a surfactant. There's just not enough research about their efficacy and the rate that you would use it. So we're not able to make that recommendation.
Yeah, typically there are surfactants that you can purchase that are researched and are approved for use in a herbicide to make sure that product is working effectively. I'm going to go ahead and get into some of these invasive plant profiles. That way we have time, and I'm going to move quickly through these. If you have questions, as John has mentioned and Allison has mentioned, please reach out to us and we're here to help you. These are notorious invasive plants, but these are not a comprehensive list. The first one that I want to talk about is the Bradford pear. This is an ornamental tree that when it was first introduced, we didn't really anticipate it being an invasive threat, but it has definitely showed to be one. It's a very weedy tree. It's a weak structured tree that we commonly see in our landscapes. You can see here the characteristic white flowers that you see in the early spring, as well as the oval shaped leaves that undulate along the sides of the margin and that are finely serrated on that leaf margin. Those are ways that you can identify it. And of course, the fruit being a Bradford pear, you can see that as a great identifying feature. Cut stump method is our best method, painting or spraying on the herbicide, but we've got to be mindful of suckers that can result when we cut the Bradford pear. The picture on the right shows those suckers. I do want to mention that we have a new bounty program that we're excited about here in Buncombe County that will be taking place on October 4th. If you want to learn more details about that, go to our website and look on the left-hand side of the screen and you will see Bradford Pear Bounty. The program is through the North Carolina Urban Forest Council in partnership with the Wildlife Federation and Cooperative Extension. Basically, you provide evidence before and after photos of you removing a Bradford pear, up to 5 Bradford pears per individual. If you show proof of each of those 5, you will get a free native tree replacement as part of this program. We're very excited to offer that, again, primarily to Buncombe County residents, but it is open to all North Carolina residents. Moving on here, Tree of Heaven. This is one that we see a lot of in our region. These distinctive compound leaves can have 20 to 30 leaflets on the tree itself. You can see these bright red samaras that contain the seed. One Tree of Heaven plant can have up to 300,000 seed produced on it in a growing season. So you can see how invasive these plants can be in terms of their fruit set. You can see here the characteristic leaf scar on the leaf tissue itself. If you crush up the leaf or stem tissue of this plant and smell it, it almost smells like peanut butter. That can be used as another identification characteristic. Typically for control here, we're going to use triclopyr. The best time of treatment here is June through September. But importantly, we do not want to do cut stump treatment or cutting it off at the base and then painting herbicide. Tree of Heaven has what we call auxiliary buds located in the trunk itself. So when we cut the trunk off, we stimulate all of these buds to come up from both the root tissue and the stumps. You can see here a picture on the right of a bunch of seedlings coming up of Tree of Heaven as a result of cutting off the trunk. So we want to minimize that by really using 2 different methods. If the trunk diameter is above 3 inches, we want to use hack and squirt. Typically in the bottom foot section of the trunk, we'll hack or make a mark and then take your herbicide mix and spray into those hacks. You want to basically have a hack every inch. So we're making multiple hacks and we're spraying a systemic herbicide, in this case triclopyr, to get good treatment. So that's if you have a larger specimen. If your Tree of Heaven is smaller than 3 inches in diameter, foliar spray is typically best. So that's generally how we control for Tree of Heaven. Japanese knotweed is an invasive plant that we see oftentimes along the waterways of creeks and streams. Very tenacious, and it comes up from any rhizome fragment left in the creek banks. During Helene, there's obviously a lot of concerns of moving it from one site to another. But you can see here the characteristic features, the red stems with lenticels dotting its surface. The stems themselves almost look like bamboo and the nodules that they have. And the stems are hollow when you cut into them. So you'll see that. You see this characteristic white flowering and this ovate, almost spade-shaped leaf that's really characteristic of Japanese knotweed. Typically, treatment here is a blush cut. We're preliminarily doing a cut this time of year, and then we're waiting around 8 weeks to then spray afterwards. There's been a lot of research done in terms of Japanese knotweed control, If we cut it and then try to put herbicide on that cut, we don't really see as good of control as if we cut, let it flush out over the course of about 8 weeks, and then foliarly treat it. Typically, if you make a cut in June, we're following that up with a spray in August. Repeated spraying is critical because these rhizomes are tenacious. If you are near an aquatic area, you're going to want to use an aquatic labeled herbicide. In the case of glyphosate, which is what we would recommend here, rodeo or aquaneat are both aquatic formulated herbicides. Important that you follow the label on where you can use these products. Multiflora rose is another very common invasive plant, brought in originally as a living fence to contain livestock, but of course that had unintended consequences here. I know John mentioned the Carolina rose earlier, which is a native rose that we have in our environment, but Multiflora rose differentiates itself from Carolina rose. Multiflora rose has clusters of flowers. When you see Carolina rose, you're going to see a solitary flower born at the tip. That's one surefire way of identifying the differences there. You can see what the fruit looks like and that characteristic trifoliate leaf. Typically for control, we're going to use triclopyr or glyphosate in the late winter or early spring. The key being we're using it before the leaves emerge. Typically, cut stump is what we're recommending here. So you want to apply it at a time of year where that flush has not yet occurred, but it's about to occur to get good control. Foliar applications can work, but you're going to need very thorough coverage. For Multiflora rose that's very dense, it can be hard to get enough coverage to really remedy that. So painting those individual stems of that shrub is probably your best control method there. Chinese privet is one that, again, brought in ornamentally, was at one time offered widely in the ornamental trade. We see this hopefully being offered less and less, but you still see it out there sometimes for sale. Characteristic thick, glossy leaves. The margins are entire. They're not going to be serrated, but you see them in opposite arrangement. The flowers in the spring are oftentimes very fragrant and they're floriferous. So you're going to see lots of flowers. The drupes that are born, the fruit in the fall, it's going to be a dark berry appearance and they're going to be born in mass. So you're going to see a lot of those. Cut stump treatment, again, is our typical treatment method here, but timing is important. We're going to want to apply in the fall going into winter. Repeated applications are often needed because if you look at the root systems of privet shown on the right, they can oftentimes sucker and come up from the root system. Privet is one that you're going to need to make repeated applications of. Oriental bittersweet, this is one that we experience a lot of in our area. You can see here characteristically the fruit and the leaves are going to be generally what we use as our identification characteristics. Oriental or Asiatic bittersweet is going to be more oval in nature. It's going to have some serrations along the margin. The fruit is bright red. You're going to see it in the fall. This is a deciduous vine that's going to be vining up and down a lot of our native vegetation. You can see here what some of those vines look like. The girth of some of these vines is impressive to see, and it can really destroy a lot of native vegetation. It can pull down trees. Healthy Oriental bittersweet can do that. So foliar applications, again, after a cut flush, we talked about cut flush as being a strategy to make it more susceptible to herbicide treatments. So we're going to cut and then treat 8 weeks later with glyphosate. You can also do the window cutting, which is useful for larger vines that are on a native tree that we want to save. Repeated applications are oftentimes needed to get good control of Oriental bittersweet. Kudzu is another plant in question here. You can see the hairy stems and hairy leaves that are oftentimes identifying characteristic there. They are trifoliate, so they're always going to be born in 3. The blooms are also very characteristic, brought for both ornamental and erosion control originally. This is one that in a healthy environment in a summer day can grow up to half a foot in a day's time. So this is one that can cover a lot of ground quickly. There's groups that focus on getting to quite literally the root of the problem. These volunteer groups do impressive work. There are groups through Conserving Carolina, as shown here. You can see the tubers on kudzu can be massive, the size of an adult person. They're very tenacious. Generally, flush cut and treat method is useful. You've got to get good coverage if you're going to do a foliar spray of kudzu. Timing is critical, especially when we talk about applying it when they're young and actively growing. If you wait too late, that cuticle is going to get thick and you're going to see less absorption. We talked about goats as being a really good biological control for kudzu as well. Microstegium, or Japanese stiltgrass. Alison mentioned this earlier. This is one that can grow both in the sun and shady environments. But you can see the leaves are what is characteristic that we can look at here. It's wiry in appearance. The stems are wiry, but you're going to see a characteristic white or silver midrib in the leaf tissue itself. This is one that we deal with a lot in our area, and that is a heavy seeder. That's one of the key strategies to dealing with Japanese stiltgrass. There are several chemistries that we can use. Glyphosate, glufosinate, glyphosate can be used while actively growing, but you want to treat or mow before it seeds, typically mid-July. We want to make sure that whatever treatment, we do it before it goes to seed, because it can seed thousands and thousands of viable seed per individual plant. This is one that can build up in a seed bank in a hurry. You can see here the flower structures are very small. The flowers are born right at the axil of the leaf. So it's going to take some really active monitoring to know when optimal time of treatment is. Elaeagnus, or autumn olive. This is one that is common in our periphery, forest edges. You can see the silvery leaves in the picture on the left, and then the thorns on Elaeagnus are just unreal. This is one that is a big nuisance. Typically, cut stump or basal spray treatments can be applied in early fall. If you do a foliar treatment, you're going to have to get adequate coverage. This is right when that growth is first observed, typically in May. You have to wet at least 50% of the leaves, and knowing how thick Elaeagnus can be, this can be a challenge. So cut stump treatment is typically what's recommended here. Golden bamboo, or bamboo in general, this is one that we deal with a lot in our area. You can see the characteristic zigzagging of the nodal tissue of bamboo, and bamboo is relatively easy to identify. Mowing is a critical management tool that we should use. Bamboo only has one apical bud per year. So if you cut that apical bud off, you stop all active growing for that season. So repetitive mowing can be a really good strategy, but you can see here in the picture on the right, those bamboo shoots are coming up via the rhizomes. So it's going to take repetitive mowing to really get good control. Mowing can be paired with glyphosate and triclopyr mixed together in the same tank. That's applied on new shoots in the early spring to get good control. Repeated applications are really important. You can see the rhizomes there in the picture on the left. They can spread out up to 100 feet from where the original plant occurred. So bamboo can be a huge issue. Burning bush here, this is one that I always like to say, at every McDonald's, you used to be able to find a burning bush. This was one that was planted very commonly in a commercial setting. You can see the characteristic wings along the stems. Another name for it is winged euonymus, for that corky winging that you see along the stem, as well as that characteristic bright red fruit born in the fall. The fall color is where it gets its name, burning bush, as bright red fall color. You can see it here in this woodland setting. Glyphosate or triclopyr is what's recommended for use here. Typically, a foliar application can be recommended again mid-May through fall, but cut stump treatment is going to be our ideal form of control here. If you can, be mindful that repeated applications are going to be probably needed, because the root system on a euonymus shrub can be pretty tenacious. This was just a rapid fire list of invasives that we wanted to highlight today, but that's not to say that there aren't others, right, in our area. Here's some listed and photographed here. We mentioned English ivy. Importantly, that's one that if you do spray and control it, we want to do that in early spring, then retreat 6 weeks later. Okay. If you wait too late to retreat, you're not going to see good control. This is one where it oftentimes needs dual applications of a herbicide to have effective control. And then also note that window cutting could potentially be a good strategy here, because that is a vine. Miscanthus, pictured on the bottom, is one that thrives in disturbed soils. There's a fire risk associated with miscanthus, so just be mindful of that. Typically, treatment for miscanthus is a flush cut. We're going to cut everything to the base, allow it to regrow, and then 8 weeks later, treat it again with a herbicide. That's typically what we would use there. Wisteria would be similar to our Asiatic bittersweet. Here are some resources that you have at your disposal. Of course, always feel free to reach out to either me or Allison or the master gardeners and can assist you and connect you with resources that are available. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them, and thanks for having me today.
Well, thank you very much, Luke. That's quite a rogues gallery of invasive plants for us to deal with here. There are two questions. One person asked specifically about stiltgrass. Will cover and smother help, and would it be best to mow and then cover?
Mowing or the smother and cover method for stiltgrass is going to be hard because it has those underground rhizomes. Oftentimes, I've even seen this strategy used and it will just grow out from around that covering. That's not to say that you can't use it to prevent further seeding out and paired with maybe an herbicide treatment. So cut, smother for a period of time and then go back in and treat after mowing. That could be a potential strategy. But just a long smother and cover is probably not an effective strategy for long-term control.
Got it. Thank you very much. One final question, and this goes back to the Bradford pears. The Bradford pears in my yard here do not have any thorns, and the Bradford pears that I'm seeing in the fence row where things are invasive are often quite thorny. What's going on there?
That's a great question. Bradford pears and calorie pears are both pears that you see oftentimes that are seeding out. There's what we call a juvenile stage of development that Bradford and calorie pears undergo, where you see in young juvenile tissue, when those trees are younger, typically more sapling sized, you're going to see heavy thorns on the stems. As that tree grows out of its juvenile stage, you're going to see less and less thorns on the growth of that tree. That is a characteristic that we see in calorie and Bradford pears.
Okay, so the thorny ones I'm seeing are probably just juvenile Bradford pears, and they're still subject to eradication and control. I appreciate both of you coming in and doing this, sharing your expertise with us. I want to thank you all for being here. Please come back and join us next month, July 17, where Luke Owen is going to appear again and present a program on the proper planting techniques for trees and shrubs. So once again, thank you all for being here.